Asian carp are suddenly disappearing from the Illinois River, and the culprit shocked everyone. A biologist leaned over the side of a boat near Starved Rock, pulled up a net that should have been bursting with fish, and found almost nothing. For 15 years, that same stretch of the Illinois River had produced hulls so heavy with Asian carp that crews joked about the deck sinking under the weight. Now the net came up light, dripping, and mostly empty. Nobody on that boat said it out loud at first, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Something had changed, and nobody had approved it, planned it, or paid for it. The strange part isn't that the carp are disappearing. The strange part is what's actually causing it, and it is not the answer most people online are ready to believe. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back to a batch of ponds in the American South a few decades ago. Catfish farmers were fighting a losing war against algae. Their ponds kept turning green, oxygen kept dropping, and fish kept dying. Somebody remembered that in parts of Asia, farmers had used certain species of carp for centuries as living filtration systems, silver carp and bighead carp in particular, fish that swim with their mouths open and strain plankton straight out of the water column. Import them, drop them in a pond, and the water clears up almost like magic. It worked. The ponds cleared. Everyone was satisfied with the fix. Then came the floods. Ponds overflow. Levees fail. Fences meant to hold fish in a controlled pond were never built to survive a river spilling over its banks, and when that happened, carp didn't escape all at once in some dramatic breakout. They leaked out slowly, a few here, a few there, into drainage ditches and creeks that eventually connected to the Mississippi River system. Within roughly a decade, they were established and breeding throughout the Mississippi Basin, and from there they found the mouth of the Illinois River and started pushing north. The biology of these fish is what turned an accidental release into a full-blown ecological emergency. A single female silver carp can lay hundreds of thousands of eggs in one spawning season, and under the right conditions that number can climb past 1 million. There is nothing native to these rivers built to compete with reproduction on that scale. Worse, silver carp and bighead carp don't just compete with native fish for food. They attack the very base of the food chain. They filter out plankton, the microscopic drifting life that every single native fish depends on during its first weeks after hatching. Bass, catfish, native shad, sunfish as larvae, they all need that plankton to survive. When an invasive species eats the foundation faster than anything else in the water, the entire structure built on top of that foundation starts to collapse, no matter how tough or fast or fierce the native predators higher up the chain happen to be. The Illinois River bore the worst of it. Survey crews began recording numbers that sounded made up. Over 10,000 carp packed into a single kilometer of river in certain stretches, with Asian carp making up the majority of all fish biomass in some pools. Native species like gizzard shad and bigmouth buffalo, both important forage fish for larger predators, went into steep decline, not because carp were eating them directly, but because carp were eating what they ate and getting there first every single time. Then there's the part that turned this from an ecological story into a public safety story. Silver carp jump. A boat motor, a sudden vibration, and a 10-pound fish can launch itself several feet straight into the air, and when one jumps, a whole school around it often follows. Boaters, anglers, and water skiers on the Illinois River have been hit hard enough to suffer broken bones, concussions, and deep cuts from a fish they never even saw coming. State agencies keep records of these injuries because the problem is real and ongoing, not exaggerated internet folklore. All of that would have been contained to downstate Illinois if the river simply drained somewhere quiet. It doesn't. The Illinois River flows north, toward Chicago, and more than 100 years ago engineers reversed the flow of the Chicago River and dug a shipping canal that connected the Mississippi River basin directly to Lake Michigan. Before that canal existed, the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Basin were separate watersheds with separate fish populations. The canal opened a permanent door between them, and that door has stayed open for over a century of continuous shipping traffic. Lake Michigan isn't just another body of water sitting downstream of a fish problem. It supplies drinking water to tens of millions of people across the upper Midwest, and it supports a multi-billion-dollar fishery built around whitefish, perch, lake trout, and salmon, an entire regional economy resting on a food web that Asian carp had already proven they could dismantle. If carp established a breeding population in Lake Michigan, the near-universal expert consensus was that there would be no realistic way to reverse it. That threat is why the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers installed an electric barrier system in a canal roughly 36 miles from Lake Michigan, sending a current through the water strong enough to turn back or disable any carp trying to swim through. That system has been running continuously since the early 2000s, with redundant barriers built, so the current never goes down for maintenance. On top of that came an even larger federal and state project near Joliet at a choke point called Brandon Road, a layered defense combining underwater sound, bubble curtains, flushing locks, and additional electrical current, budgeted at well over $1 billion, aimed at permanently sealing this single stretch of waterway against one invasive species. It is one of the most expensive and technologically elaborate campaigns ever built against a single kind of fish anywhere in the world, and even with all of it in place, carp continued reproducing faster than removal crews could keep up. That gap between spending and results is exactly what pushed people toward a very different, much more emotionally satisfying idea. Instead of building more machines, why not bring back a predator that could do the job on its own? And there was a specific candidate everyone kept pointing to, a fish so large and so strange it sounds almost mythical, the alligator gar. The alligator gar can grow past 8 feet long and several hundred pounds, making it one of the largest freshwater fish native to North America. It's covered in thick, diamond-shaped armor scales, has a long toothy snout, and has existed in more or less its current form for tens of millions of years. For most of that time, it sat at the top of the food chain in southern and midwestern rivers, an ambush predator that had no serious rival. It should have still been living in Illinois waters when the carp invasion began. It wasn't, and the reason it wasn't is its own story about human decisions, not the carp's. For generations, fishermen and even some state agencies treated the alligator gar as a trash fish, an ugly, unwanted nuisance that stole bait and tangled nets. People shot them in the shallows, clubbed them on the deck, and in some places ran organized campaigns to wipe them out under the belief that killing gar would leave more resources for the sport fish people actually valued. At the same time, the habitat gar needed to reproduce was disappearing. Alligator gar don't spawn in open river channels. They need shallow, seasonally flooded backwaters, vegetation-choked shallows created when spring floodwaters spill over the banks. Decades of levee construction and dam building across the Midwest were specifically designed to stop rivers from doing exactly that, because flooding threatened farmland and towns. In stopping the floods, the engineering also eliminated the only place alligator gar could successfully breed. The species was being killed directly, while simultaneously losing its ability to reproduce at all. The last confirmed wild alligator gar caught in Illinois was recorded in 1966, and by 1994 the state formally listed the species as extirpated, extinct within Illinois specifically, even though it survived elsewhere in its historical range. By the late 1990s, attitudes among fisheries biologists had genuinely shifted. The trash fish framing gave way to recognition that the alligator gar was a legitimate native species that deserved restoration, independent of anything to do with carp. Federal and state hatcheries began breeding alligator gar in captivity, and in 2010, Illinois started releasing young hatchery-raised gar back into its rivers for the first time in more than 4 decades. On its own terms, this was a genuine, quiet conservation success, a species humans had wiped out, deliberately brought back home. The timing, though, is where the two storylines collided in the public imagination. Gar were returning to Illinois rivers at almost exactly the same moment Asian carp numbers were becoming a statewide crisis, and it didn't take long for people to connect the dots into a much more dramatic narrative than the facts actually supported. An ancient native monster, coming back from extinction specifically to devour the invasive fish nobody else could stop. Illinois lawmakers picked up that framing in 2016 legislative language describing the gar as a fish large enough to prey on adult Asian carp, and national outlets ran headlines built around the same idea. It's an incredible story. It's also not what the biologists who actually manage these fish have said happened. The people running Illinois' gar restoration program have been clear for years that the reintroduction was never designed as a carp control strategy. The goal was restoring a native species that human activity had erased from the state and giving anglers a genuinely rare native giant to pursue again. Nothing more, nothing tied to the carp problems specifically. The numbers back up that separation. Between 2010 and 2013, Illinois released roughly 6,000 young alligator gar into its waters, and only around 1,500 of those fish are estimated to have survived to any meaningful size. Set against an invasion measured in millions of fish and tons of biomass per river mile, 1,500 surviving predators simply cannot move a population that large, no matter how effective each individual predator might be. There's also a physical limitation that quietly undercuts the entire monster versus invader narrative. A gar's mouth, however impressive, only opens so wide. Young Asian carp are vulnerable to gar predation for a brief window early in life, but they grow quickly, and once a carp reaches a certain size, it's simply too large for a gar to swallow. A grown silver carp can swim right past an adult alligator gar with nothing happening at all, because the predator that's supposed to eat it physically cannot. So, if the returning alligator gar isn't what's driving carp numbers down near Starved Rock, what actually is? The honest answer is less cinematic, but it's real and it's measurable. The first and biggest factor is sustained, large-scale commercial removal. Illinois pays licensed commercial fishermen to target Asian carp specifically, with an incentive on top of the standard market price per pound. Over roughly 15 years, that effort has pulled tens of millions of pounds of invasive carp out of the Illinois River, with removal totals climbing into the tens of millions statewide and continuing at a pace of multiple million pounds per year in recent seasons according to state and federal fisheries reports. Some of that harvest now gets sold under the rebranded name Kopi, a marketing effort launched in the early 2020s to make the fish more appealing on restaurant menus and encourage direct consumer demand for it. Crews have also used tactics borrowed from commercial carp fisheries overseas, herding fish with sound into shrinking nets, and some operations have tagged captured carp with tracking devices to help locate schools for future removal. The second factor is less intuitive: water quality itself. Closer to Chicago, the Illinois River carries decades of urban runoff and treated wastewater, and researchers studying young silver carp have found that fish placed in samples of that more degraded water become noticeably sluggish, expending extra energy just to cope with the conditions. Combined with fewer suitable spawning grounds in the more channelized, concrete-lined stretches near the city and the physical barriers of locks and dams, the upstream front of the invasion has effectively stalled for over a decade in the same general area, roughly 50 miles from Lake Michigan. On the rare occasions individual carp have slipped past that stalled front, fisheries biologists caught and examined every one of them, and none showed evidence of an established breeding population beyond that point. None of this means the threat is over. The lower Illinois River, further from Chicago, still holds an enormous, actively reproducing carp population, and a single female carp there can still produce over 1 million eggs in one season. The upstream decline that's getting attention right now is a localized, hard-won result built on continuous funding for commercial removal crews, ongoing monitoring programs, and a natural but fragile hydrological barrier, not a permanent, self-sustaining fix. The long-planned Brandon Road Interbasin project, the massive layer defense system near Joliet meant to make this protection permanent, has faced funding delays and land acquisition hurdles, even as Illinois recently secured land needed to move construction forward. So the alligator gar keeps coming home, generation after generation of hatchery-raised young slipping into rivers that forgot them for half a century, and that restoration remains a genuine wildlife success story worth celebrating entirely on its own terms. It just isn't the reason Asian carp numbers are falling near Starved Rock. The real explanation is a combination of paid commercial fishing crews working year after year, a rebranded fish showing up on dinner plates, and, ironically, some of the same polluted water Chicago has spent decades trying to clean up. It's a less thrilling story than an ancient monster rising to save the river. It also happens to be the one that's actually true, and the one that depends entirely on whether that funding and effort keeps showing up every single year. If it doesn't, there's nothing stopping the carp from pushing north again.